Britain once celebrated a Chinese company for saving British steel. 6 years later, Britain took the company from that same investor. The government calls it national security. Jingye calls it expropriation. But here is the part London cannot explain away. After taking control, the losses did not disappear. They got bigger, and British taxpayers inherited the bill. On July 16, 2026, the British government brought British Steel into public ownership. Its argument was simple. The Scunthorpe Works operates Britain's last 2 blast furnaces. If they close, Britain loses its last domestic capacity to make primary steel from raw materials. That matters for rail, construction, infrastructure, and potentially national security. So in the official British story, this was not a corporate takeover. It was an industrial rescue. But that story begins far too late. Go back to 2019. British Steel had collapsed into compulsory liquidation. Britain needed an outside buyer to keep the plants open and thousands of workers employed. In March 2020, China's Jingye Group completed the acquisition. The British government publicly welcomed the deal. It said the sale protected more than 3,200 jobs. It praised Jingye's pledge to invest £1.2 billion over 10 years. At the time, Chinese capital was not described as a security threat. It was described as the rescue. Jingye says it went on to invest more than £1.2 billion in British Steel. It also says the business was losing around £700,000 every day. Those losses did not come from one bad manager or one Chinese decision. British steelmakers faced high energy prices, global overcapacity, import competition, carbon costs, and the enormous expense of replacing old blast furnaces with lower carbon technology. Jingye did not create those structural problems. It inherited them, and for years, it paid to keep them alive. There was also a concrete modernization proposal. In late 2023, British Steel announced a £1.25 billion plan to replace the aging iron and steelmaking system with 2 electric arc furnaces. The company said the plan depended on appropriate support from the British government, and that talks had begun in 2022. No agreement was reached. The British government later said it offered £500 million of co-investment. Jingye concluded that the remaining cost and operating risk still made the transition unviable. Then the commercial logic collided with the political logic. In March 2025, British Steel announced consultations on closing the Scunthorpe blast furnaces. From the owner's perspective, continuing to lose money indefinitely made no sense. From the government's perspective, allowing the furnaces to go cold meant losing a strategic capability that would be expensive and difficult to rebuild. So Parliament was recalled on a Saturday. On April 12, 2025, it passed emergency legislation giving the government power to direct the company's operations and control the use of its assets. The legal owner remained Jingye, but the British state was now deciding whether the furnaces could close. That created a remarkable arrangement. The investors still owned the company, while the government overrode the investors' exit decision. And then reality delivered the most important fact in this entire story. Once the government took operational control, British Steel did not suddenly become profitable. According to Britain's National Audit Office, the government spent £377 million between April 2025 and the end of January 2026 to keep Scunthorpe operating. By then, continuing operations were costing around £1.3 million a day. Jingye had reported losing about £700,000 a day. The later state-backed cost was almost twice that earlier headline loss rate, although the two figures cover different periods and are not perfectly like for like. That does not prove every decision made by Jingye was correct. It proves the losses were real. You can change the flag above the factory. You cannot nationalize away the cost structure. In July 2026, Britain completed the process and nationalized British Steel. The government says the company's commercial value at the time of nationalization was zero because of its poor financial position and history of losses. Jingye rejects that position. It argues that Britain first forced it to surrender operational control, then took ownership after years of Chinese investment, while offering almost no compensation. The final compensation question has not been settled. British law requires an independent valuer to determine what, if anything, should be paid. Jingye says it will pursue its rights under the China UK investment framework. So it would be premature to claim that a court has already ruled the nationalization unlawful. No such ruling exists. But the damage to Britain's investment message does not require a court judgment. Foreign investors can see the sequence for themselves. When British Steel was bankrupt, Britain welcomed Chinese money. When the losses became unbearable, Britain restricted the owner's ability to leave. When the asset became politically essential, Britain took ownership and argued that its value was zero. Britain does have a serious counterargument. A blast furnace is not a restaurant. You cannot close it on Friday and casually reopen it next month. Scunthorpe supplies vital products, including rail. Thousands of workers and suppliers depend on the site. Once the last primary steel capability disappears, rebuilding it may take years and billions of pounds. No responsible government can ignore that risk. And past investment is not the same as present market value. A company can absorb billions and still be worth little if its future losses are even larger. Those are real points, but they do not erase the central contradiction. If primary steel was truly strategic, Britain should have treated it as strategic before the emergency. It should have built a viable energy policy, a credible transition plan, stable procurement, and a clear agreement about who would pay for decarbonization. Instead, it allowed a foreign investor to carry the losses until that investor tried to stop. Then a commercial failure was reclassified as a national security emergency. Britain's own 2026 steel strategy quietly confirms that ownership was never the whole problem. The government announced lower electricity costs for eligible steelmakers. It cut import quotas and imposed a 50% tariff on steel above those quotas. It set an ambition to raise the domestic share of steel used in Britain from roughly 30% to as much as 50%. Those policies may help, but they also reveal what was missing while Jingye was expected to keep funding the plant: competitive power, protected demand, and a stable industrial framework. Britain changed the rules only after it changed the owner. This is why the British steel case matters far beyond Britain and China. Western governments increasingly say they want supply chain security, industrial sovereignty, and less dependence on foreign production. Fine, but strategic capacity is not free. If a country wants domestic steel, ships, batteries, semiconductors, or machine tools, it must pay for the conditions that keep those industries alive. It can pay early through infrastructure, energy, training, procurement, and patient investment. Or it can pay late through emergency laws, nationalization, compensation disputes, and permanent subsidies. Britain chose to pay late, and paying late is usually more expensive. By the time a blast furnace is hours away from losing essential raw materials, the government has no bargaining power. It cannot design a careful transition. It must buy coke, secure or keep workers on site, pass emergency legislation, and promise whatever money is needed to prevent an irreversible shutdown. That is not industrial strategy. It is industrial panic. The real scandal is not simply that Britain nationalized a Chinese-owned steelmaker. It is that Britain invited foreign capital to rescue an industry it had allowed to become uncompetitive, and then changed the rules when the investor could no longer carry the burden. The blast furnaces are still burning, but the bill now belongs to the British public. And every foreign investor is watching how Britain handles the compensation. For Chinese companies, the lesson is blunt. Do not confuse a host government's praise with durable protection. Do not assume that a contract can enforce itself when politics changes. Price sovereign risk before investing. Preserve evidence of every commitment. And make sure you have legal, economic, and diplomatic leverage before accepting responsibility for another country's strategic assets. A contract without the power to defend it can become nothing more than paper. Follow me, and I will take you inside the real story of China.